Hi and welcome. This is Ed Kohler with Extreme Networks, and today we're going to talk about the current cyber threat security landscape. And as you can probably guess, it's a very active subject, so buckle up and let's move forward. The agenda is going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to talk about current challenges, and we're going to move on to emerging threats, trends that we're seeing out into the 2022 and beyond. And then we're going to turn to a proactive type of angle, and we'll talk about education as well as policies and practices that you can institute to increase your security posture and profile. So let's start with the current challenges. This year, I'm working off the VMware Global Security Insights report. Last year, I worked off of Verizon. I typically pick one that matches the subjects that I want to cover, and VMware definitely covered some of those, and I'd like to talk that here. So 76% of attack volumes have increased in the last 12 months. Of those, 78% who had cyber attacks said that it was largely due to increased amount of people working from home. So it shows that COVID has indeed changed the attack surface and has increased our vulnerability from an overall security posture perspective. Of those who experienced a cyber attack, 79% said that those were more sophisticated. And I'm going to talk about that as well, particularly when we are into the emerging threats section. And then 82% of those said they suffered a material breach. What do we mean by a material breach? We mean exfiltration of the data, personal information on the dark web, things of that nature. Industrial espionage, another thing, intellectual property theft, and then simple ransomware as well. All of those are examples of a material breach. The top causes for those who had a cyber attack, 14.4 was the winner. Third-party applications, 14.4%. Ransomware at 14.3, and we are seeing a resurgence in the ransomware arena. And then out-of-date security technology and processes were about 14% of those caused, and then 8% for OS vulnerabilities. So I think this is a very good snapshot of causes. And if you kind of look at the trade rags and what we see as far as the news, I think these match fairly well. Now, the good news is that there is the recognition for a need for a shift. 61% agree that they need to view security differently due to the change in the attack surface expansion that the pandemic has instituted. Keep in mind that many folks, including myself, are still working remotely or at their residence, so this needs to be accommodated. We at Extreme, with Extreme IQ Cloud, we provide a lot of visibility and security down into the residence, and that, I think, is a very big piece of the puzzle that needs to be addressed. 63% agree that they need better contextual security in place to track data through its life cycle. This is a very important thing, and commonly this is very often ignored by different organizations in the overall security posture. So this is a good thing to see, starting to treat data itself as an object that needs to be protected and secured and tracked throughout its life cycle. 63% agree they need better visibility in the overall data and applications to preempt attacks. Visibility we're going to come back to again later on in the presentation. And then 43% are building more security into their infrastructure and applications, as well as reducing the number of point solutions. And this results in a just smoother operation model for the security operations. And corresponding to that, 41% have updated their security policy and approach to mitigate risk. So these are all good signs. It's showing that we are recognizing that the game is being upped and we need to increase our skills in response. Some interesting trends to watch. There is a growing concern about applications development and consumption. And this really talks about code supply chain. A great example of that is SolarWinds, highlighted down below. When we look at supply chain, particularly from the code perspective, we use open source software and we bring them in, we import them and implement them in our code, and we could very well be importing and implementing vulnerabilities if they do exist in that space. So we need to start paying attention more to that. Production workloads are increasingly being realized as points of vulnerability. Doesn't matter what you make, whether it's code, You're creating an application, you're selling software, whether you're creating a networking switch, which Extreme Networks does both of those, or whether you're creating a car or a piece of medical instrumentation. Your production workloads are your most critical asset, and they need to be treated accordingly. Home networking, as we've already talked about, is creating blind spots in security visibility. We need to address that as well. And then overall, we're seeing an increase in botnet activity within the IoT space as well as the ICS and OT space. And ICS stands for Industrial Control System, and OT stands for Operational Technology. Corresponding to that, we've seen an increase in supply chain attacks, Colonial Pipeline, JMS Meats, Molson Coors, SolarWinds, which we've already mentioned, and we will see an increase in supply chain attacks moving forward, and IoT, ICS, and OT will be increased vectors in this space. Ransomware resurgence, and I want to emphasize that there are new players, and we're kind of showing the new kids on the block, DarkSide, Revil, Sori no Kibi, and then also News. But we also have to realize that there are many other ransomwares out there that are still in vogue, and many are resurging, and they're being optimized, they're being updated. So the bad guys are doing the same thing we do. They're upgrading code, they're bringing in new features, new capabilities, so forth, so on. So ransomware, by far, is not a dead subject. As a matter of fact, you're going to see a resurgence in 2022, and that will reflect what's already started to occur in 2021. Cobalt Strike and Evil Grab are proliferating. Now, many people don't know what these are. Cobalt Strike is a reconnaissance tool. It's actually used by the good guys, but being a reconnaissance tool, it can be very effectively turned for malicious purposes. Evil Grab is a piece of code that's used to gain and steal credentials, so it's all about credential theft. When you take the two together, the reconnaissance and the credential theft capability, they can be a very dangerous combination. So we're starting to see that. And by the way, these were involved in the SolarWinds attack. Emerging threats. So let's talk about what's coming down the pike. More of the same, really, but with innovation, because the bad guys are just like us. They're improving all the time. They're improving their own skill sets, they're improving their own tools, they're improving their own code sets. They're doing the same thing that we do. Ransomware will increasingly use IoT and ICS as attack vectors via botnet payload, and I'll talk about the rationale of why. And this corresponds to the rise of ransomware as a service. And I highlight Conti and Black Matter. There are two very common ones, but there are many others out there. And what is ransomware as a service? Well, what it does is it allows you, as a normal user, if you happen to have a bad side to you, you could go out and with minimal code expertise, just pay for a ransomware as a service like Conti or Black Matter, and then you could launch your own ransomware attack. And you don't have to have any expertise in order to do so because you're going to use a service. So this is something that is actually rather dangerous when you think about it, and we're starting to see a rise in that, particularly when you combine it with botnets. Exposure is increasingly being viewed as more lucrative than encryption. So rather than just simply encrypting your data, they're starting to realize that it's much more lucrative to threaten the exposure of that data. And this results in basically what's called a double whammy ransom, where, okay, you have to pay me in order to unencrypt your data, and then, oh, by the way, you have to pay me in order for me to keep this information secret and off the dark web. And it goes without saying that you should never pay the ransom because 9 times out of 10, the encryption key and the decryption method is far too slow, and you'll end up backing up from backups. That's actually what happened at Colonial Pipeline. They paid the ransom, but the decryption process was so slow that they basically had to pull from the data stores, and they just did backups. So they paid a lot of money for nothing, really. But then when you look at it, also paying money to keep the information off the dark web, that is really just, it's a foolish notion to think that you're going to trust someone that once you pay them that money, that they're not going to post your information out and sell it. Remember who we're dealing with. Supply chain attacks will continue to occur in increasing frequency, so don't think Colonial Pipeline and JMS Meats were the only ones. We're going to see more of them. Nation-state actors are becoming much more active, and aspects of cyber warfare are quickly evolving in this space. Critical infrastructure, as a result, is becoming a very active target. Water distribution, oil and gas distribution, power grid, and remember, all of those have a strong use of IoT, OT, and ICS type systems. And on that, IoT, OT, and ICS, they are increasingly being used in automation for these types of solutions. Nation-state advanced persistent threat groups are growing in number and becoming much more active, and IoT, OT, and ICS are key attack vectors for these groups. Why? Because they're typically very lightweight Linux VxWorks OS systems. They have low and focused CPU power, which limits any security capabilities whatsoever in many instances, and the devices are typically very difficult to patch. As a matter of fact, they're usually located in very difficult locations as well. Let's look at some of the overall stats. Now, the important bullets I want to talk about are on the bottom of the slide. 34.3 million IoT attacks in 2019, and that has increased to over 40 million in 2020, and I do not have the numbers for 2021. But what has not changed is it takes under 3 minutes to hack an IoT device, particularly one that has default passwords and default code measures. 6 months to discover the breach. Now, 3 minutes to compromise a device, 6 months to discover that it's compromised. I don't have to tell you that those are not good numbers, and we need to basically close the gap on this significantly. Now, let's talk a little bit about ransomware. We have our annual ransomware damage that was estimated to be 20 billion in 2021. Actually, it exceeded that. We were around 22. Ransomware as a malware code is intended to encrypt the system and basically force you to pay a ransom. But as I said earlier, it's increasingly being realized that exposure is being increasingly viewed as lucrative, even more lucrative than just the encryption. So usually ransomware is evolving now not only to do the encryption, but exfiltration of the code sets as well. So that not only does the code that you have is encrypted, but also the bad guys have a copy of your original data as well. The typical form of payment is in cryptocurrency, but it's important to look at this from a timeline perspective, and then you'll start to understand the overall trend that I'm banging towards. If we look at this, in 1989, we had our first version. This is the first recorded version, PC Cyborg. And we can see that there were a few others before the advent of the Android and the Bitcoin. Now, back before the advent of Bitcoin, ransomware had to be done the old-fashioned way. You basically said, hey, put the money in a brown paper bag or a briefcase and put it down on the corner of 6th and 49th, and I'll pick it up at 7 p.m., and there was obviously a lot of risk in that type of thing. But with the advent of Bitcoin, things changed. Digital currency changed, and the advent of the dark web changed. So now we had a method of anonymous currency that could be used to not only charge for the ransom, but receive payment. And then you had basically secure anonymous conduits through the dark web so that these attackers could actually get a much more eloquent way to get their money. Note, however, that with Android and also iPhone, there was an increase in BYOD and IoT since the advent of 2008-2010. And I think we've all seen the increase in BYOD and IoT in our environments. This is increasing the attack surface, folks. This is increasing the attack surface. Bitcoin is providing the ability for a much more eloquent way to pay the ransom, and the dark web is providing a way to expose your information if you refuse to work with the attackers. So these are very important data points that need to be realized, and they really only become obvious when you start looking at the timeline. Now, the last thing I want to note is that after the advent of digital currency, the numbers and the varieties of ransomware have increased significantly. These are only the major players on the right-hand side of the slide. If I really wanted to fill it all in, I could fill up this whole slide with a list of all types of ransomware that are out there currently in vogue today. Now, the traditional method is to get a human to do something, and that's either through phishing, through a malicious type of link attachment or email attachment, waterholing, a malicious website, or a combination of both, the ability to phish and then direct you to a waterhole, and from there I can get you and encrypt your data and exfiltrate your data. Now, all of these methods require a human to do something. So I have to fool a human, I have to get them to click on something, I have to get them to go to a website. But the Botnet Factor is changing that, because I can infect one and spread to the many, and I can do that via IoT. And this becomes particularly effective if the IoT devices in question are not properly segmented from the IT in the user communities. And realize that Mitre isn't the only botnet out there. And so we need to be worried about quite a bit more. But while we're talking about Mitre, let's look at the latest. We have a new and improved Mitre. Nation states are entering the picture. They're taking the code. And Mitre has been there for a while, but this is one that's having the dust brushed off, and they're making improvements. 11 new exploits, bringing the total to 27. And yes, ransomware is among them. New propagation and obfuscation methods, new credentials for brute force, the extensions of the target list into infrastructure systems as well as enterprise systems such as digital signage, and take a note on Palo Alto's Unit 42. IoT Linux botnets will continue to expand their attack surface, either by the incorporation of multiple exploits, as per the point above, note the increase in exploits in Mitre, or by the adding to the list of default credential or brute force or both. And as you can see, Mitre is effectively doing that here. I want to talk a little bit about social media, because this is part of the emerging threats as well. Is it cybersecurity? No, but it can affect a cybersecurity practice. And I actually have a whiteboard talk that I've done this in my last video. It actually talks about the psychological impact of what happens during a cybersecurity incident. Now, here I want to point out the fact that we do have increasing trends of misinformation or disinformation that is causing social division and instability. Realize that there are real events, true information, the Robert R. Murrow, if you will, of the events, something that happened as it happens. But there are two other classes, misinformation, which is unintentional, and it's usually quite innocent. It's someone either hearing something through a gossip chain or reading something and misunderstanding the context. Whatever the case may be, it's largely unintentional, but it's not correct, okay? And it's not malicious, so it's fairly innocent, okay? Someone didn't understand something and maybe said something that wasn't correct. Disinformation is a separate category. This is when it's intentional, it's fabricated, and it's malicious. It's propaganda. It's intended to get you to think in a certain way. And if you don't think the bad guys use this, then you're wrong. They use it very, very effectively. Human beings are psychological beings. Therefore, it is very important for us to understand the impact that technology is having on the human psyche. And I think that it's something that we really do need to start investigating and getting a handle on. We've also seen an increase in censorship and labeling in politics, in pandemic information, and also trolling. Now, some of this can actually result in social security compromises, where the actual security of the civil infrastructure can be compromised by the disinformation. And this is one of the reasons why I want to talk about this here. Be very careful of what you hear. Make sure you validate what you hear or what you read. Multiple sources of information are very important for this to occur. Education. Seeing as we finished with psychology, let's move off into the area of education. Because as things have changed, we also have to realize that users need to increase their level and gain a level of understanding for proper security practices. We at Extreme have started a number of programs. We have educational videos and quizzes, and we score. And if you don't pass the test, you need to take the course again. internal staged phishing campaigns with tracking. And if we find people that are multiple offenders, we will take them and put them through training, and then we will basically put them through the staged phishing again, and hopefully we see an improvement. And quite frankly, we have. We've seen significant improvements since we've started these programs. But users also need to be educated regarding organization security policy as well. And this is proper use of resources, the computing resources, the network, so forth, so on. Proper considerations for applications and data, as well as proper labeling of data. Knowledge of regulatory requirements and proper practices. And then there's a secondary class of users, which are our code developers. They need to be educated regarding proper coding security practices. And again, educational videos, quizzes and scoring, certification programs, internal papers and guides, all of these allow us to educate code developers so that they can increase their proper practice for secure coding. The security administration is no different. They need to up their game as well. New tools and techniques need to be understood. Better knowledge and understanding of attackers, very important as well as their tools and methods. Cyber wargaming activities, I highly recommend. Focused application level activities, make sure you do it in a closed environment, not in your production network. Increased knowledge of offensive security techniques, and there are two organizations I highlight here, OWASP, Open Web Application Security Professionals, and then also CEH, Certified Ethical Hackers. These are great communities where you can get certifications for proper offensive security, and I highly recommend them both. The use of communities and groups, CIS, CSA, and Mitre, and I'll talk about these in the subsequent slides. CISecurity Controls basically maps out a series of controls, basic, foundational, and organizational, that you can use to map out your security posture and practices. There is not only a general IT one, but there is also an IoT, ICS type version of the CISecurity Controls as well. I highly recommend both. This is a recommended site and also a recommended community. Cloud Security Alliance, this is basically to promote the best practices for providing security assurance within cloud computing. And it provides education. It's a great community. Extreme Networks is a very active member within this community. And again, I highly recommend them. And as you can see, I'm providing the web URLs for each of these communities as I go through them. Finally, Mitre Attack, which is a knowledge base that creates a taxonomy of both attackers and malware and methods and tools. Now, the matrix itself is very difficult. Many people go up and they try to, quote unquote, read it. That's not the way you use this tool. You have to use it in a focused method. So my recommendation is pick a vector, and that could either be a type of malware. So for instance, DarkSide. You might say, okay, DarkSide ransomware, I'm interested in this. So you start from DarkSide ransomware. From there, you find the tools, the methods, and the groups that might be using DarkSide. Or you might change and you might say, okay, well, I want to go at it from an advanced persistent threat group. So maybe I'm interested in Cozy Bear. So then I can start from Cozy Bear, and then I can start to map out the malware in the code that they used, and you might find that DarkSide is one of them, and actually it is. But also, you can also find out the specific tools and methods that they use the malware with. And this is a great thing because it allows you to create detailed incidents, response plans, and then also planning and testing for your own security operations staff through red teaming and also adversary emulation, which is a very healthy exercise to improve your ability to defend against these types of intrusions. Now let's turn to policies and practices. I'm going to list these out here. We're not going to talk about them in detail. What we'll do is we'll go into each of them in detail on the next slides. Risk assessment is really the first step. You need to inventory everything, and I mean everything. Your IT, your OT, your IoT environments. And then once you have an asset list, you need to do a risk assessment against all of them. And it's best to prioritize. Now, if you cannot prioritize yourself, your business leaders probably can. They can tell you what's critical, what's important, what absolutely must not go down. And from there, you can prioritize not only your assessment, but also when you identify vulnerabilities, you can prioritize your patching and addressing of the vulnerabilities. And don't be afraid to hire third-party expertise in order to help you here. Sometimes a separate set of eyes is a very, very good thing. Visibility. 61% of networking professionals had no or low confidence that they knew every device connected to their network. That kind of touches on my risk assessment on the previous slide, doesn't it? Let's face it, folks. You cannot secure what you do not know about. If you do not know about a system, you do not know if it has any vulnerabilities. And if you do not know that, then you do not know what the vulnerabilities are. And there's no way to protect that system because you do not even know it exists. Application telemetry is a very critical piece of securing the infrastructure. And realize that while application telemetry is very good for east-west, centralized firewalls can provide you very good visibility of north-south. In other words, traffic moving in or out of a given segment. Policies. Firewalls are limited in the effectiveness to establish policies at the east-west traffic level. So policy-based network segmentation is really what it's all about. Strong policy-based access control to complement that segmentation. And then when we look at OT and IoT and ICS type systems, the best approach is a whitelist profile. And what do we mean by a whitelist profile? Well, we mean basically the allowing of a very narrow profile of traffic communication and denying all other activities. And then you need strong monitoring of systems both into and out of the segments using firewalls. And this is where firewalls can be very eloquent. You want to look for anomalies within IoT, OT, and ICS environments because anomalies will always be something bad. It might not be malicious, but it shows that something is not right in the IoT, OT, or ICS environment. So it's either a defect or it's some sort of malicious activity. Anomalies need to be tracked down. Isolation and segmentation. In the event of a breach, segmentation is the difference between a simple incident where you just did a response and it stayed internal and a total catastrophe where you end up in the news. Again, I want to emphasize, isolate your IT, your OT, and your IoT environments, but also take a look at the slide here. Don't just lump all of your IoT into one big segment. Notice here we have surveillance, we have imaging, we have PCI, we have EMR. All of these are on separate segments. They're all IoT devices or IoT segments, but we do not want to have them all mixed together in one place. Strong access controls for membership into those segments, audit trails to make sure that devices are where they are and you can generate the information after the fact. And then tiered environments from a segmentation perspective are very much admired and should be used. And this is very often done in production environments, manufacturing, but also it should be more incorporated into just IoT, OT, general practices as well. Why? Because it slows or prevents the propagation of malware throughout the environment. And while you might be affected and you might be impacted, you will not suffer the major breach. You will not suffer the major catastrophe, and largely you can contain it and keep the situation under control. Cloud security is very key as well. Data compliance, regulatory compliance, business continuity, and disaster recovery plans, very key for this. But also remember that if you are using cloud backup, make sure those copies are offline so that they cannot be affected by any of the malware that is currently affecting your environment. Emerging technologies, and there is a lot out there to bolster network security. Application telemetry, improving its analytics to get to behavioral analytics. IoT, OT, and ICS systems, picking out anomalies, finding odd behaviors. Users, human beings, a little bit more difficult. User behavior analytics is a little bit more complex, but artificial intelligence and machine learning will help us in that area. And remember that while firewalls lack the lower level east-west visibility, application telemetry can give us that. So when we combine firewalls and application telemetry together, and effectively merge them, we can have a true, good, granular end-to-end visibility within our environment. Enforce proper practices. I'm not going to go through all of these. I do have a separate presentation that I've done on this. I believe it was last year that I did this, 10 best practices to zero trust. But the whole point of this slide is that it is an ongoing business cycle. It has to become part of the day-to-day practice, what I call the Zen of proper security practice. And I do have an ebook that is available on our Extreme Network site. This is a great ebook that goes through the top 10 network security practices and how you can best incorporate them into your environment in order to increase your security profile and posture. In summary, folks, it's getting interesting out there. Challenges are getting much more complex and difficult. As smart communities and infrastructures become much more common, there will be a vast expansion in the potential attack surface. And keep in mind that most of these will be using IoT, OT, and ICS of some form or fashion. Cyber actors are becoming much more sophisticated, and more importantly, they're becoming much more patient. They will wait under the covers for quite some time before the right moment arises. Security teams need to step up to the challenge by education and proper practices, as well as users as well. New tools and techniques will be required in order to stay up to pace. Groups and organizations are there to help. And don't forget the human psychology factor. Try to avoid being pushed into a fear mode or a panic mode, because at that point you become reactionary. This is where the bad guys want you. Stay on the pragmatic side. Avoid fear. Stay proactive. And you can only do that by establishing your incident response plans prior. And again, Mitre Attack can help you do that. Once you have those, then you're much less likely to be pushed off into a fear factor. Don't give up. Realize that every day the battle never ends, and it probably never will. We'll have the same thing next year and the year after that. Look at it as job security. But don't give up. Above all, don't give up. Because while you're in a chess game that you can never win, you can never get rid of the advanced persistent threats, you can make sure that they never win. And that really is what we are all about. Finally, don't let technology drive us. We drive the technology. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this session. Have a great day.